Along the banks of the Tennessee River in what is now Kingston stands the site of a frontier stronghold that once marked the edge of a young nation's ambition. About 35 miles southwest of Knoxville, this ground once held a federal outpost that shaped early Tennessee history, Fort Southwest Point. Construction of Fort Southwest Point began in March of 1797, but the military presence here had already taken root years earlier. In 1792, a simple blockhouse was constructed about a half a mile upstream. It was modest. It had wooden walls and limited space, but it was strategically vital. Between 1793 and 1796, the blockhouse was garrisoned by a small group of federal contingent of just 10 to 15 troops. Their mission was clear: maintain order on a volatile frontier. The blockhouse stood on a sensitive line, the boundary between the Cherokee Nation and the United States territory. It was positioned near the North Carolina Roan, also known as Avery Trace, a critical route stretching westward towards Nashville. This road carried settlers, trade, soldiers, and opportunity seekers into the western territories. As tensions and responsibilities grew, it became clear that the modest blockhouse was no longer sufficient. A decision was made between 1793 and 1796 to replace it with a much larger and more permanent fortification. Although early construction records were later destroyed in a fire, historians have determined that the fort was completed by July of 1797. Federal troops under the command of Captain John Wade and Captain Richard Sparks oversaw its construction. Originally, the fort bore the name of Fort Butler in honor of Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Butler, commander of federal forces in East Tennessee, but by 1798 the name had changed, becoming the one we know today, Fort Southwest Point. This was not simply a military post. It stood at the crossroads of diplomacy and defense. The earlier blockhouse had played a crucial role during the years of conflict between the Cherokee communities and the Anglo-American settlers. However, by 1795, hostilities had begun to decline. Even so, the fort remained active. It continued to be garrisoned by federal soldiers until 1811. Fort Southwest Point became far more than a defensive structure. It evolved into a major point of interaction between Cherokee Nation and the United States government. Here negotiations occurred. Messages were exchanged. Authority was asserted. At the same time, the fort served as a way station for early migrants traveling between Knoxville and Nashville. Wagon trains passed by, families stopped to rest, soldiers watched from the walls. The fort stood as both protector and symbol, representing the federal presence in a region still defining its future. Lieutenant Colonel Butler moved his headquarters to Fort Southwest Point in 1799. When 9 companies, 7 infantry, 1 artillery, and 1 dragoon, totaling roughly 400 to 500 troops, were garrisoned at the fort. Around the same time, lots had been sold for what eventually became the city of Kingston, named for Major Robert King, an officer stationed at the fort. Among the first duties of the Southwest Point garrison was to remove individuals known as squatters who had settled on Cherokee lands illegally. However, the first Treaty of Tellico, which Butler helped negotiate in 1798, resolved many of the issues regarding squatters and reduced the need for federal troops in the area. By 1801, Southwest Point garrison consisted of roughly 100 troops. In 1801, Colonel Return Jonathan Meigs was appointed Cherokee agent and military agent for the War Department in Tennessee. Although its garrison had been reduced, Fort Southwest Point served as an office for Meigs and as a distribution center for the Cherokee annuity. Meigs immediately began negotiating with the Cherokee in hopes of obtaining permission to build a wagon road across their lands connecting Knoxville and Nashville. In 1805, the Third and Fourth Treaties of Tellico brought most of the Cumberland Plateau regions under U.S. dominion, making the road possible. As the treaties pushed the U.S. Cherokee border south to the Hiwassee River, the garrison at the Southwest Point no longer needed. By 1807, Meigs and most of the federal garrison had relocated to the Hiwassee area. A skeleton contingent of less than 5 soldiers maintained Fort South West Point until 1811.